Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Humans 2.0 podcast. This is your host, Mark Metry. Today, I'm joined by Charles Muhlbauer. Charles, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm,
Thanks very much for having me.
Of course, man.
This is super cool.
Yeah, man. I'm super awesome. super glad to have you here. Charles, we could start off. We could go into a lot of places, but
Sure.
I would love it if you could sort of take us back to, what's your origin story? How did you get your superpowers that you have today?
Superpowers. It took me a long time to realize one of the two superpowers I would say that I currently have. So briefly, when I was a kid, I was always singing. It's something that I've always had a passion for. Ended up going for voice lessons and ended up becoming a professional singer. So I've been singing professionally for about 20 years at weddings and events and stuff like that. Never something that I wanted to do like full time. I was too practical, but whatever that means. But I've been doing my whole life. And then for 10 years, this sounds a bit opposite, but for 10 years of my professional career outside of singing, I was actually a CPA. So I was an accountant.
Got a lot of friends.
Yeah, so it took me a while to get out of that and kind of see the light for myself. I ended up jumping into tech sales and did like a 180. So the other superpower that I developed was being a sales professional and helping. Now I help other salespeople become more professional at their sales calls. So that's the other superpower that took me a lot longer to acquire and to figure out. It's a whole story in and of itself, but yeah.
Man, I have a lot to go into, but
yeah.
Just want to ask, is there like a particular story that stands out to you, like early on in your early life that you look at today with any kind of like, reverence or signification of, a little bit how that got you on your journey or anything of the sort?
Yeah, so I guess specifically with regard to sales, I do have a crazy story, if I can share.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for.
So this particular story was the turning point, pretty much in my professional career. There's no question about it. I was a CPA for 10 years in the last company that I worked at, which was Deloitte. My partner at the time we had an evaluation meeting where they ask you, tell you how you're doing, ask you how you're doing at the company, etc. And so I had a meeting with my partner, and he sat down and he asked me, he said, "So Charles, are you happy here?" And at this point I was in accounting for like 10 years. A decade, which is crazy.
You're right.
And I didn't really know what I wanted to do next exactly, but he asked me that question, and I had like a voice in my head saying, "Charles, you can kind of just make something up and say that you're happy here and that you're doing well and what have you, or you could be honest with him and see where your life takes you." Yeah. And I looked at him, and his first name was Martin, and I said, "Martin, are we having an open conversation here?" And he said, "Absolutely, we are." I said, "Okay," and I went with the honesty, and I said, "I don't think this is for me. And I think I should be in sales. That's what's coming up for me." And he looked at me, and he's huge smile on his face. And I'm like, "Why are you smiling?" And he looks at me and he says, "I think you'd be great at sales." I said, "Wow, thank you." And he said, "Have you ever thought about doing this type of sale or that type of sale or what have you?" After I told him what I really wanted to do, I knew that I wasn't going to be there anymore in some form or fashion, which I was okay with, obviously. That's why I was okay with being honest with him. And at the end of the conversation that we had, he said, "Listen, I'll try to help you get into sales here. If I can't, you make sure that whoever is about to hire you and they ask for a reference, you make sure that they call me, because you worked your ass off for me, and I want to make sure that we have a relationship." I left. Maybe a few weeks later, a month later, I got an offer for my first sales role, And he was the reference, and he came through. And
Shout out to Martin.
yeah, shout out to Martin. And yeah, I'm still in touch with him to this day. It was pretty unbelievable. Actually, after that conversation, they assigned like mentors at the company for you. So I had a meeting with my mentor, and she's like, "Oh, how'd it go?" I'm like, "Oh, I told him I didn't want to be here anymore." She's like, "Oh, okay." And it felt great. It took a lot of guts to tell him that. And people were like, "Oh, aren't you worried? You're not gonna have a job." I don't know. I just didn't care. It was a very weird feeling, but it totally changed my life.
Wow, man.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry if that was a little long story, but
No. No, I thought that was beautiful, man. And
yeah, it was very scary too.
I bet, man. I bet. And what I want to get into is, I have so many friends that are CPAs. I also know a ton of people who are CPAs today who are trying to get out of it with like their side hustle or a different position. Again, I'm not like trying to, badmouth the position or anything.
A lot of people love it.
I wouldn't do it for sure. Like, couldn't pay me $1 million. But, the question I have for you is like, why did you do it for a decade? Did you hate it the entire time?
It's a fantastic question.
Yeah.
This was also, I started working in 2003, and this was like way before. There weren't such thing as podcasts. There wasn't startups. Wasn't really a thing. Like LinkedIn wasn't big, right? So these things weren't discussed really, and so I didn't really know what else was out there. Number one, number two, I was always scared to leave a job without having a job because everyone was telling me not to do that, and so that kept me in doing it. And then I also had I felt like, no, if you just do it again, maybe it'll work. If you would just work harder, like definition of insanity type of thing. Even though I was kind of insane and I did the same thing over again, expecting different results. I just didn't know what else was out there, and I didn't know how to leave. I just didn't know how to leave until I felt that for some reason I felt like I had a bug in me that I wanted to generate revenue or produce instead of analyze. And that's why it took me so long to leave. And, that's okay. That's it took me a while.
You're here now.
It took me a while. Yeah, it took it took me a while to figure that out. And then when I did leave, my good friend Donnie Zoldan, he called me up. I called him up maybe the day I left the firm, Deloitte, just to say, "Hey, what's up?" And he's like, "Hey, what are you doing tomorrow?" I'm like, "Oh, nothing. I have nothing to do now." And he's like, "Why don't you come to New York Tech Day?" I'm like, "What's New York Tech Day?" And he's like, "Oh, it's like the biggest tech networking event in the United States or in the world at Jacob Javits Center every year." I'm like, "Sure, I'll come. I got nothing to do." I went to New York Tech Day, and I'm like, and this is after 10 years of being in corporate America, saw thousands of tech startups with CEOs. Hey, I'm 25, I'm 28, I just made this company. I'm like, what? I felt like I entered in another galaxy. I swear, it blew my mind. And then I found the company that hired me to be their salesperson without having any sales experience. It was funny, even when they interviewed me, they're like, "You have no sales experience." I'm like, "Yeah, I know."
I'm gonna do it.
But they took a chance on me, and yeah, that's how it all happened.
Definitely, man. And
yeah,
man, one of the reasons why I do this podcast is because, I think there's a lot of different kinds of podcasts, and there's a lot of different reasons why people listen to podcasts for sure.
Right.
But one of them, I think, is to, when they hear somebody, just, ordinary people like us, talk about things that, are in the gray, not so much the black and white of when you were in that mindset of doing it for a decade, with fear, sort of, I don't know what it was like. I'd love to sort of focus in on that just a little bit more because I imagine there's a ton of potential CPAs, a ton of CPAs that are listening to this. And even if you're not a CPA, just doing something that you don't do, maybe you've been at it for a decade, but it's that mindset, that state of mind, it's you almost don't know you're in it until you're out of it.
Right.
So specifically, what was that
yeah,
like?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to explain it.
Yeah.
So I realized, it took me a while, longer than others to realize it, but I realized that looking around my peers in accounting at the time. I mean, by the way, Mark, I haven't spoken about accounting in a very long time. This is interesting for me. I realized after a couple of years, like starting to look at my peers who were on my level or above my level or lower than my level in accounting, and I'm like, am I going to be just as good or better than anybody else on this team at this job? And I'm like, no, I won't. I just won't. This guy's better than me at this, and he's better. And basically, I looked around. I'm like, everyone I work with is better than me at this, and that's not cool. I'm like, I need to be in a place that I know I can compete, healthy competition with people on my team, where I'm like, I'm just as good as these guys, or I can be better than all of them. And for some reason, when I started my sales job, even though that's another story, even though it took me a long time to actually be successful, I was failing for a very long time. I almost got fired, whatever, a whole nother conversation. I was like, I have to be good at this. I don't know why. I was like, I know I can beat the top guy. And I never had any experience in sales. It didn't make any sense, right? But that was a realization that I had in accounting. I'm like, I'm not going to be better than anybody else at this job, and that's not a place. That was number one. Number two, I didn't have a passion for it. That was going to be a problem long term. Number three, there was a story. I sang at a wedding, maybe when I was 28 or so, 29. And after I was done singing, or during like a break that I had, an elderly gentleman, maybe in his 70s, at the time, came over to me and he's like, "Oh, you sang great. Thank you so much." I said, "Thank you so much." He's like, "What do you do during the week?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm an accountant." I couldn't believe this happened. And he said to me, and he's like, "I was an accountant my whole life." I said, "Wow, that's great." And he said, "If I could have done it differently, I wish I did something else." My mouth dropped. And I said to myself, I'm like, "Charles, you're going to be that dude if you don't do something." Now, granted, it took me a while to do something about it. But when I heard that, it resonated with me because I was feeling that too. And that made me change. And then the last thing I'll say is I realized, like, for a career, I split it up into like 3 buckets pretty much.
Okay.
I was like, Charles, careers land in 3 different buckets. Bucket number 1 is you're really good at analyzing things, financials or data, extremely detail oriented, love charts, putting things together. It's bucket number 1, the analysis bucket. And then I was like, bucket number 2 is I pictured somebody on the phone the whole time, or shaking hands, or being with people. So I was like, not necessarily a people person, but someone who likes to listen and talk and maybe develop relationships. That's bucket number 2. And then I was like, bucket number 3 is there are people that can do both. They're like, they're just all-stars. Usually investors, like private equity investors, have both of those buckets. So I was like, Charles, which bucket are you? I'm like, there's no way I'm bucket number 1, the analysis. I was in accounting for 10 years. I can't do it. And I'm like, bucket number 3 is an obvious non-choice because it requires bucket number 1 also. I'm like, it's got to be bucket number 2. And so I went with it, and it rang true to me, and I finally figured it out, and I know that that's my strength.
So I'm curious, like, how did you like stay sane? How did you cope during that decade? Was it like singing? Was that your main outlet?
Nah, I just got, I started doing drugs. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's possible. I've
had so many people on that show
that
say
I
that.
apologize. I apologize. Didn't mean to demean it.
No,
No, how did I stay sane? That's a good question. I think no one ever asked me that before. I think, and this is not really a great answer, but I didn't care so much about it.
Yeah.
Which is not cool. And also I sang on the weekends, and that was something that I loved to do. I was making money from it. And don't get me wrong, like I had a lot of like hurdles and trouble while I was doing the job. Because if I wasn't doing a good job, and I'd have meetings with people about it.
Oh, yeah.
And they tell me, like, you're not doing a good job. And it was very uncomfortable. But when I went home, I was okay. For some reason, I was able to sleep at night. That's not a good sign. Yeah, I don't know what kept me sane.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
I
don't know.
No, man, I really love that answer, and I love the first one you gave of you didn't care, and I feel like for me, when I was at a time in my life where I wasn't doing what I was born to do or whatever, it wasn't necessarily like I hated being in every minute of it, but it's just sort of like this apathy, like this sort of like this disconnection
I know.
of your life, and like you may have moments of it, whether you're out like singing on the weekends, but it's like whatever you think of like your soul, your heart is like trying to inch you slowly to be in there. And I think it takes like a moment where when Martin asked you that question and you have this decision to make, and all of a sudden you hear that voice inside of you that maybe you haven't heard in a while. For me, like also, I feel like for a lot of us, that's how a lot of life decisions get made. There's always like this space between this decision where you hear sort of the real you, and you're like, damn, I've been doing this for a decade. I'm just like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm just going to go all in on this other thing, even though I don't know. And it might be super scary.
Yeah. And it's funny. My first interview for a sales role at a company called Axial, which is a great tech startup company. The CEO at the time, who was Peter Lerman, was pretty much giving me my final round interview. And he looks at my resume and he's like, what the hell are you doing here? And I said to him, Peter, I said, most people in life never get the chance to realize what they really want to do. And for most of the people that even do realize what they really want to do, most of those people don't have the guts to go ahead and do it. I said, I realized finally that sales is something that I want to I'm going to love it. I've never done it. I just feel like I'm going to love it. And number two, I have the guts to go after it. So I said, I can get an accounting job anytime I want. But I'm here for a reason.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was pretty honest with him. He liked it. He liked my chutzpah. Yeah.
You gotta have that.
Yeah, you gotta have it, exactly.
Especially in sales, and they're like, there's that stereotypical quote that's like, you're selling your way through life. Every kind of, interaction, although you may not necessarily directly be selling somebody, but you're selling somebody on, an idea. You're selling somebody on, whatever, like a culture. Maybe it is a product or service. So I think sales is really, really, part of life for sure, no matter who you are, even if you're not in sales specifically. And I want to know for you, when you jumped onto the ship with really no kind of experience, were there any first successes, or any first stories or signs where you were like, oh wow, I might actually be good at this, or the opposite of you just failing and failing? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, my first 6 months in sales, I had a couple of sales here and there, but I wasn't doing well. And I was working my ass off. And it was very frustrating, and I was very nervous that I'd get fired. Because I was like, if I get fired from this, what the hell am I good at? What am I going to do? Yeah. It doesn't make any sense. But then I realized exactly what I was doing wrong with sales. For anybody that's listening that's a sales professional, whether you're a beginner or very, very advanced, this should kind of resonate. And what I realized what I was doing for a long time was actually I was trying to mimic what my other salespeople were doing. Oh, what questions are you asking? And all that stuff. And what are you saying? What's your response to X, Y, and Z? Which some of it you need. What I ended up doing was, and this sounds, for someone like you, probably something very foreign, but I actually was not listening to people on the phone at all. I was just concentrating on asking them questions. Yeah. And even one guy was like, I was speaking to a venture capitalist, and he was like, Charles, you're not listening to a word I'm saying. I'm like, ouch. Damn. It killed me. And finally, I got to a point where I realized how important it was to be myself on the phone. What does that mean, be myself? Like, ask questions that I want to ask. If I want to make a stupid joke, I'll make a joke. if I want to talk about something that I think is interesting that I saw on their LinkedIn or an article, I'm going to talk about it because it's interesting.
Yeah.
And then my sales, like skyrocketing. It was unbelievable. It was like unbelievable. Yeah. So sales, I find that most. I mentioned this to. You mentioned this before. I was on a podcast with John Barrow. I was talking about discovery calls, and I was mentioning to him that I find that most things in life, to be successful at it, it's counterintuitive to what you think, what your natural instincts are. Like I sing and I'm in sales. For singing, when you're a singer, a lot of what you're doing is the opposite of what you think you'd be doing. You have to sing from your diaphragm. Who would ever think about that, right? You have to keep the back of your throat open. Who would ever think about that? Or you have the breathing techniques, right? And then even including in sales, you think you have to prove something or have an agenda or accomplish something. But meanwhile, the more you back off, right? It's counterintuitive. It takes practice, but it's worthwhile.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. And, my experience is a lot of the times you sort of have to like unlearn a lot of what you've gotten. And then once you can sort of do that, then you sort of like maybe start off with like a clear slate and you're like, okay, let me try to find like the best information from the best people that are like actually doing this. But then you might find out that it doesn't work for you because there's that critical self-awareness piece.
Yeah, and unlearning sucks.
Yeah.
It's like rehab.
So hard.
Yeah, it's like you're attached to something, one way of doing things, and then you have to relearn it. It's like your body or like your emotions go through a restructuring. I can only imagine someone who's, let's say, had an addiction to something, goes to rehab. It really hurts. Yeah. But when you're uncomfortable, when you're learning something and it gets you uncomfortable, that's a good sign because that means you're learning.
Yeah.
So.
Too bad our psychology is like wired to do the opposite.
Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
God's a funny person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to create you so that you don't want to be scared of learning stuff. Like, yeah, it's a weird, weird way to think about it. But yeah, there's still stuff that I'm afraid of. And I'm trying right now to like work on my fears. I forget the name of the author. It'll come to me that he was on a podcast recently. Wrote a book called The ADD Solution, and he had like a line. I'm forgetting the author. I apologize, but there's a line in the book that kind of resonated with me. Something to the effect of like people who have had years of failure develop all of a sudden a fear of failure. Like everyone says, like, no, don't be afraid to fail.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. Something to the effect of those that have been through years of failure all of a sudden develop a fear of failure. Like people tell you, like, don't be afraid to fail. And then that's cool. And then you go, and for some people, they keep failing. Right? And then after 5 years of failure, they're like, shit. Then all of a sudden they develop a real fear of failure because they're tired of it. And so that's something that resonated with me too. So these are things that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, of course. And, it's a constant journey. Nobody's not afraid of anything.
Yeah. I also, as much as I like hearing podcasts, not necessarily podcasts, interviews, whatever, of people about their successes, I'm much more attracted and pay attention to, I like when people talk about what they really failed at more. Yeah. Because that's more, okay, you're great, successful, mazel tov. Okay, great. But like, tell us why, like things that you really messed up on and what you learned from it. That's interesting. Yeah. And that I can relate to, because then that gives people the confidence to move forward. I find those more interesting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%. And like, for me, the way that I view it is like, you look at just sort of like public perception media of like, whatever you look into, newspapers, Instagram, LinkedIn, I don't know, like the Forbes ranking, whatever. Yeah. You see sort of like, the people's successes, their vacations, their happy photos with the families. And then, what ends up happening is like, depending on the person, obviously, you might start to compare yourself with everybody else.
Everybody does, yeah.
Yeah. And then we all know every single person on the back end, everyone's got issues with whatever it may be, family or might be your health. Everyone's got all different kinds of issues. And like, which is why on this podcast, I love talking about like those struggles, those insecurities, those fears, because everybody can really relate to that.
Actually, what's cool about LinkedIn, I don't know if you use LinkedIn.
Oh, all day, man. It's like my power hub.
Oh, okay, yeah. So exactly. So there's a lot of sales professionals who use LinkedIn, and as great as a lot of LinkedIn posts are, like, yeah, go get them, do this. They're good. Like, tips are great. Yeah. I mean, I give tips on LinkedIn every day. When somebody talks about like what they messed up on or in their career, where they did well, where they didn't do well, and what they learned from it, that's interesting. Like, oh, that's cool. I can relate to that. That'll gives you the more confidence to take risks.
Definitely.
Definitely,
I love that. And on the topic of LinkedIn, just because like I'm really big into LinkedIn. I was just a speaker at LinkedIn Global like last week.
Wow, that's cool.
Dude, LinkedIn is like LinkedIn. It has a really deep place in my heart. It's like part of my come up. I'm curious to hear from you, like when it comes to like that kind of communication with people in your industry, and you see like how the different sales industry is emerging, and there are all these different kinds of sales thought leaders now that right. each one of them has
thought leader.
Yeah, each
it's
one of them.
favorite word, thought leader. Want to be a thought leader.
Yeah, they'll have like their own style. They may say information that is counterintuitive to the other or whatnot. Right. I'm just curious to hear from you as like a person who's been in this industry for a while. What do you think like doesn't work? What do you think does work?
With regard to what?
Sales and selling in that kind of communication.
What doesn't work is coming across having an agenda. I don't think any person enjoys speaking with someone who has an agenda. Now, let's be clear. We're clearly, like if I'm a salesperson, I'm clear, and I'm on the phone with somebody else with another company who's thinking about hiring us. It's clear why we're on the phone.
Yeah.
I understand that, right? But one of the biggest things I tell salespeople, and this is pretty common already for people who know how to sell and sell well, is when you first are on the call with someone, hey, Mark, thanks for connecting, etc. The purpose of this call is for me to learn as much as I can about you. I'll tell you as much as I can about us. If we determine that there's a potential fit and reason to speak further, we'll talk about next steps. And if we think that there really isn't a reason to speak further, then we won't. Is that cool with you?
Yeah. Right? I love that. It's like sort of setting the intention.
Yeah. This is the beginning of the call. Like, this is the reason why we're having the call. Maybe we'll do business together. Maybe we won't. But my agenda is not to sell you. It would be great if I sold you. Well, not necessarily. You could sell people that are not good, right? You could sell someone that you shouldn't have sold because then they become a bad client, right? But you say, listen, maybe we'll work together. Maybe you're fit. Maybe you're not a fit. If you're fit, we'll talk more. If you're not a fit, that's okay. But it's like you're stating the agenda. You're stating the purpose of the call without me saying my agenda is to do this, and nobody likes that. So you want to have some sort of peer-to-peer level of conversation. And that also allows a salesperson to challenge. Now I can challenge you on what you're telling me because I've been very transparent with you about the reason why we're having this call. I've been transparent with you about if you say no to me, that's okay. I don't care that much. So now I can challenge you on what you're telling me. So that's what I tell people to do / not to do, not have an agenda, and how to do it so that you don't really have an agenda.
Yeah, I love that because like, I'm not too much in the sales industry, but I've seen like this real emergence of like bringing the real human side into sales versus like the previous like stereotypical model of like the sleazy salesman of just like, calling like, hey, do you want this? Not whatever. So I'd love to see that stuff. And, for me to hear that directly from you to really like humanize it and bring it down to like the clear communication intention level.
Transparency.
I love that stuff. And it works, right?
It works. Counterintuitive, like we spoke about, to what you would think it would be.
Yeah, 100%, man. Dude, Charles, it's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course, man. Where can people go to learn more about yourself?
Sure. You can find me at salesshare.net. Sales, SHARE.net. or you can email me at charles@saleshare.net if you have any questions. You can find me on LinkedIn at Charles Muhlbauer and just direct message me, and I'm happy to help.
Cool. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Charles, last thing I do here on this podcast is have my guests leave the audience with like a question that they can sort of ask themselves throughout the day, or just like I don't know, if you have like an exercise or like an action that you do that you feel like has helped you, that's not super complicated, simple, but anything that comes to mind would be of help.
Sure, like advice, so to speak?
Sure.
Yeah, I would say be okay knowing that life is unpredictable and you don't know what's going to come next. Like, be okay with that concept.
Yeah.
This way, you won't be afraid of being wrong. It's easy to be afraid of being wrong, and it's good to know that life is unpredictable. So you never really know what's going to happen whether you do one thing or another. So try not to be afraid of following your intuition.
Yeah, I got to work on that one for sure.
Me too.
Charles, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, everyone out there, for listening. This has been your host, Mark Metry.